Watch The Atheist Experience live Sundays at 4:30 p.m. Central. Visit tiny.cc/YTAXP and call into the show at 512-991-9242 or connect to the show online at tiny.cc/callaxp.
It's time to get sexy on Secular Sexuality.
Hello and welcome to Secular Sexuality, the ACA show that wants to know, is that a chromosome in your pants or are you just happy to see us? I'm Christy Powell. My co-host tonight is just one base pair away from losing it. Welcome, Nate Smith.
Hey, Christy, in my defense, 23andMe can occasionally be wrong. Howdy, folks.
Hey, glad to have you. And tonight, Nate, you and I are joined by a YouTuber and mad scientist that has been genetically engineered to debunk transphobia. Welcome, student Dr. Ben.
Hi, I am so excited to be here. I am student Dr. Ben. I am a third-year medical student in the United States and also a transgender man, and I have YouTube content about the science and medicine of social issues. So I talk about biological sex, I talk about trans issues, I talk about abortion, I talk about epidemiology, all kinds of sciencey topics, and how they relate to you engaging with people in your community.
Beautiful. Super glad to have you.
Yeah, we've sort of met in the offings on a couple of other shows, but I think this is the first time that we've actually been together. So I'm super excited. I think this is going to be a great time. At some point in the show, we are going to discuss vajankles, folks, but we're going to push that to the side for now. Tonight, the main topic is we are going to be draining this genetic swamp of misinformation. So give us a call with your questions or your stories. And, you know, even if you disagree with us, I mean, maybe you got lost on your way to Joe Rogan's show, you know, we can still talk. Give us a call. It's 512-991-9242 or at tiny.cc/callsex because this show is coming right now.
All right. Well, that sound means that we are starting this week the way we do every week with what's turning us on this week. Ben, really excited to have you here. Really excited to get into this conversation. But I wanted to start with whatever's got you turned on this week.
Yeah. So, I mean, the biggest thing that's happened this week is that I am on my first ever ACA production, and I am super excited to be here.
One of us. Yeah, excited to have you. Thank you so much for coming by. We are going to make you regret it by asking all of the dumbest possible questions on our way to trying to understand some tricky and important topics. But in the meantime, Nate, what's got your engine revved up right now? What's going on?
Well, aside from trying to craft a joke about a therapist, a construction worker, and a doctor walk into a bar, what's turning me on this week is something I've actually mentioned on the show before, but it is silicone-based lube.
Mm-hmm.
My partner and I ran out last week, and well, he was not taking no for an answer, and so we had to go and sort of dig out the old water-based. I won't say the brand name because I don't want to get sued, but oh my God, the difference, folks, the difference. If you have never tried silicone-based lube, it's not sticky. You don't need as much. It's such a more pleasant experience. It's a bit pricier, but if you factor in the fact that you're not really using as much, it's really not that expensive. And oh my God, take it from Nate. Give it a try, folks.
Yeah, and if you're caught off guard by this conversation, let me tell you, know what's in your lube. Like, you don't have to get super anxious about all of the particulars, but know if it's silicone-based or water-based or these different things, because that actually matters when you're using contraception or when you're using different toys. Like, you want to be aware of those kinds of things. And yeah, silicone-based lubes, they get the job done. Nice plug. All right. Well, with that dumb pun, let's go ahead and jump into the interview. Ben, sincerely, this is a question that has dogged our show for as long as we've been doing it. We have tried so hard to have different versions of this conversation, and I'm really excited to just dedicate all of tonight to trying to answer this question. So, to the best of your abilities, for once and for all, what the hell is a Y chromosome? And what can it tell us about human anatomy? If somebody has a Y chromosome, what does that mean? What do we know about them?
Yeah, so the Y chromosome, as many people have probably heard, the Y chromosome is getting smaller and smaller over time, and there's some speculation that in the future the Y chromosome might not even exist anymore. But the things that we know about it, the Y chromosome is very small, and the X chromosome is significantly bigger. You have only very few genes present on the Y chromosome, and kind of the main one that people think of when they're referring to biological sex is the SRY gene. So the SRY gene codes for a specific enzyme called SOX9, which is going to inhibit an enzyme on the female side and cause production of male anatomy, or what we would consider to be male anatomy. So the interesting thing here, though, is there are ways that this SRY gene can move to actually be on the X chromosome. So a lot of people, when we're talking about what makes somebody male or female, and if people want to rely on this Y chromosome, it can get a little dicey, because there are cases where the keystone gene, if you will, moves to the X chromosome, and you could have a Y chromosome without the SRY gene and present to be female. And this is a point that, like, before we get like too far into the weeds here, something I want to clarify a bit about biological sex and kind of what we're talking about, so we have consistent definitions. So a lot of people love to fixate on chromosomes, or they like to pick a certain aspect of biology to be the key point of what assigns someone's biological sex, which is not a very good way to think about it, because it's multifactorial. There are multiple factors that have to be present in order to cause certain anatomical features, such as, we break this down into different categories. So the chromosomes are your genetic sex, or your genotype. That is one aspect of your biological sex. There's also phenotypic sex, which is the appearance, and that can be broken down into anatomy, and that can be either your external anatomy or your internal anatomy, because both can be different. They might not be the same. And then you can also have hormonal sex, which is if you have primarily estrogen or primarily testosterone. And it's the interaction of all three of these components that will determine how your body acts with regards to reproduction or sexual activity. And so we don't really need to look at a key point. And I debate this with people constantly. They say, oh, well, the SRY gene is really the key thing. If you have an SRY gene, you are male. Or if you don't have an SRY gene, you are female. Not taking into account that even if you have that gene or you don't, your other factors, such as your hormones, can change your appearance to make it seem like you had an SRY or make it seem like you didn't. So it can get very, very messy. And that's kind of why I wanted to be on here talking about this.
Yeah, no, and I'm so glad that you are. It goes without saying that sort of like 8th grade natural sciences understanding of genetics that's based on a bunch of like Punnett squares and sort of half listening to a teacher lecture from the front of the classroom, that XXXY dichotomy is a little bit oversimple, and I'm hoping that you can help us to understand why. I guess what I am getting from you so far is that what we know is that the that XY, the Y chromosome, often or typically carries this SRY gene, which is typically expressed in what we consider male anatomy. We're talking about the SRY gene turning into penises some of the time. I'm oversimplifying. Help me see the flaws here.
Yeah. So where we used to think of sex as being binary, we are now looking at it as being bimodal. And because we have these variations of not even just with the SRY gene, but you can have variations of people with multiple sets of sex chromosomes or fewer. So you can have somebody who is XXY, and that's typically referred to as Klinefelter syndrome. You can have somebody who is XXXY or XXXX. You can have multiple copies of X. You can have people who are XYY. You can have people who are just one X and missing another chromosome. It's very difficult to have someone who is just Y because you have genes on the X chromosome that are necessary for being alive. So normally someone who is just Y is not going to survive. So we don't typically talk about those. But it's more of a spectrum than we've thought about it in the past. And so, yes, it is more common to see everyone's, if you, again, going back to the categories of your genes and then your anatomy and your hormones, it's most common that those are all three going to line up to be either male or female. But that's not always the case. Since we have these variations, you cannot look at it as purely binary. So what we say is we're not saying that there isn't a majority case, but we're saying that not everyone fits that majority. So we need to be flexible in how we think about it and not exclude people for not fitting the norm. Because something that is atypical doesn't mean that it's not relevant and doesn't mean it doesn't exist. These are real people with real variations. And now the trick is moving from it being considered as a pathology to being considered as a variation of normal.
Yeah, so that I think has been the model for so long. We're gonna talk a little bit later about terms like intersex and sort of their modern appropriateness and some of those kinds of ideas. But I think generally speaking, the notion has been there are regular men, regular women, and then like a handful of misfits that don't really fit our model, but it's always the exception that proves the rule. That doesn't sound like the bimodal distribution that you're describing. What are the like limitations of that kind of model?
Well, I mean, thinking medically, a lot of times with people who have a difference in sexual development that would cause them to have these variations, a lot of them don't know that they have these, or you wouldn't even be able to tell. And most of the time, you would know. There is some clear anatomical variation that you can see that would classify someone as having a variation. But there are specific case reports that I've even covered on my channel where you have, I think both of these were like around like preteens to early teens ages of boys who they had identified as male. Their anatomy was typically male. Their hormones were male. They just seemed like normal, if you will, boys, presenting for something not even related. One of them had an accident on his bike where he straddled the bike seat and got a rupture of one of his testes. So he wasn't even going in. Yeah, I know that's a painful thing to think about. But that he didn't even go in with any issues related to reproduction or with abnormal anatomy. He had a trauma to the area. They ultrasound it, and they find out that he has a mass in one of his testes. And so they look at it, and they found that it was half ovary, half testis. So this person who appeared to be a typical male, you never would have guessed that he had a difference in sexual development, had ovotestes. And so with something like that, they karyotyped him, found out that actually the majority of his DNA was XX, and he had a mosaic Klinefelter. So only the DNA in his reproductive tract was XXY. And so that's where he got the SRY gene to have that anatomy. But the rest of his body was XX. And he had both sets of gonads. So
I didn't even know that was possible, that you could have like two different sets of genetic information within the same, within the same person.
yeah, it's totally possible. And it relates to a lot of either chromosome non-disjunction, where chromosomes don't properly separate during mitosis and meiosis. It can also happen with if someone's a chimera, where if you have a twin in utero, and this is something that I know has been on those law shows, like law and crime shows, where they can't find the perpetrator because they have two sets of DNA. But that's a real thing. You have people who have a twin in the uterus that they sort of absorb, and they have multiple sets of DNA. And if you have that only in certain parts of your body, then you'd have only that genetic representation in that part. So if you swap out your reproductive tract with XXY or XY when you would normally be XX, you're going to see the effects of that.
Well, I think the temptation here is to maybe see this as a bunch of like very progressive, like whataboutism. Like, okay, well, there are these kind of rare exceptions, and you see these like really fascinating TED Talks where you'll have somebody who very clearly presents as what we all would understand as like a conventionally attractive woman, explaining that she has like a Y chromosome, and that's just the way that it presented, and everybody freaks out. And then you start to think, okay, but how common is this really? I know that you mentioned at the top, kind of 3 different categories of differentiation that are all blending together to create our presentation, for lack of a better term, or a more scientific one, I guess, or more precise. But when we're talking about the genetics, how often do those get thrown off, or how many variations, or how often do we see variations in genetics like the ones that you're describing?
So we see this quite frequently, actually, and especially with the genetic stuff, it's a bit more rare. The more common ones that you will see are Klinefelter, which is XXY, or Turner syndrome, which is X, just one X. Those are the most common, and I know people with Turner syndrome, it's more difficult to tell that they have it. They'll present like being shorter in height. They sometimes might have some heart issues. But apart from that, you might not be able to tell someone had those chromosomes. Similarly, with XXY, you might have a more feminine presenting male. So you'd have somebody with male genitalia, but they have wider hips, or they might grow breasts. So those are the most common in terms of chromosomes. But then looking at hormones, and hormones can do a number for your presentation, and those are extremely commonly variable, especially in things like polycystic ovarian syndrome. Is a case where females produce high amounts of androgens and testosterone. And so if somebody with PCOS, especially a severe case of PCOS, were to get pregnant and they had a high level of testosterone exposure to the fetus before their birth, you can have effects of testosterone on that baby. So testosterone does a few things for the development of male anatomy, and it actually signals for the maintenance of the mesonephric duct, which will become most of the internal reproductive tract for a male presentation. And then, so it is going to stimulate that, and it's also testosterone inhibits. It can help inhibit the paramesonephric duct, which stimulates the female tract. And then testosterone also, if it is converted to DHT, which is a stronger form of testosterone, that can lead to external male presentation as well. So you get high levels of testosterone on a fetus that's developing, you can create male anatomy. So even something that's maternal, that parent had the hormone imbalance in their own body, that can affect the fetus, even if the fetus had XX genes. So that is one example. Another kind of example with hormones, trying to think of, because PCOS is a really good one. Things like androgen insensitivity, where they don't respond to testosterone, that can change their presentation. That's a genetic thing as well, but where they can produce testosterone, but their receptors don't work. So even if you had an appropriate amount of testosterone, it can't signal anything. So if you can't stimulate the mesonephric duct to become the male reproductive tract, it is going to then switch over to the female pathway, and it's going to create female anatomy. And you can get incongruence with those. So that's a couple examples. There's plenty of examples where we see how hormones affect these, and there are more than I can count of differences in sexual development that can result. And that's why I made videos on it, because you really, like, people want to take this as such a black and white issue about what sex is, and not even going into gender, because adding gender and societal norms on top of it is a whole other complication. But just even talking about biology, like, the people who don't know the ins and outs of this, of course they can assign what they think is typical or not, but you really get into the nitty gritty and you realize that you really can't assign much just by looking at somebody.
Yeah, well, so I want to make sure that I'm following along, and then just kind of summarize a lot of what you're saying, because it is very different from this like two-box system of you're either one or the other. There are all of these different factors, and I don't even want to say that sometimes things can go wrong. But there are oftentimes that you will have a gene that's not actually showing up, or you will have a hormone that isn't actually doing its job because it's not being received in different ways. And in all of these cases, whether we're talking about like typical development or atypical development, there are just so many switches that, you know, nobody is having 100 out of 100 switches flipped or 0 out of 100. Everybody's got some sort of blend. And you mentioned that idea of a bimodal distribution. And I don't have one to show people. There is one in the show notes to this episode, but I'd really encourage people to just Google that word, because I feel like if you're not familiar with statistical distribution, that picture might be the most accurate way of describing what we're talking about here. Do I have it all right so far?
Yes, you do.
Yeah. So if we are all sort of these like blends, this, you know, sort of yin yang of like, maybe I'm 99% quote unquote male and 1% female, or if I am, you know, 15% female and 95, you know, those kinds of ratios, is that at all an accurate way of understanding this, or is there something more to it?
I mean, that's one way to think about it. In terms of practical application, I get into these discussions quite frequently with people, especially trying to use these arguments to oppose trans people, which is a whole different conversation that, like, they don't even need to bring sex into that conversation. But you get people that want to say, why can't, and from a medical perspective myself, because I'm going into a field where I will be treating people, and of course, it's important to know the anatomy and physiology of the people that you're treating. But people say, well, why can't we just assign people to this box? Like, if you are going to treat a person that looks like a man, aren't you going to medically treat them different than someone who looks like a woman? And that points out a really important concept in the healthcare system, even, of people are individuals. You can't just slap a treatment on everybody. And I'm sure everyone has experienced this with their own healthcare providers at some point, where there was a treatment that was recommended or that was works for a lot of people, and maybe it didn't work as well for you, or maybe you had to go through an alternative like step, like if you had to get extra imaging or extra something because something wasn't working for you the same way that it works for everybody else. And that's just because we're individual people and we don't all fit this one box. And so maybe instead of saying, well, I need to make an assumption about you in order to treat you, maybe you treat them as an individual and you take it step by step, and you can evaluate, okay, is their anatomy this? Do they have these organs? Like, you shouldn't be going to, like, say, a gynecologist. Let's say you have a cisgender woman who had a hysterectomy. That person's a woman, but they don't need the same evaluation as somebody who has a uterus, right? So if they don't have a uterus, we can rule some things out. Like, they're probably not pregnant and they probably don't have uterine cancer. But so I can't even just say this person's a woman. I need to evaluate them for uterine cancer. No, I know that they don't because they don't have a uterus. So putting someone in a box is lazy, and it goes against the critical thinking that we should be having when we should be able to read their history and say, okay, you have this anatomy. This applies to you, or your hormones are in this range. So I can use this kind of treatment with you. So maybe instead of relying on the box to further hateful arguments, we should work on how to be productive without relying on a crutch like a box.
Yeah, well said. I want to give Nate a chance to jump onto the phones here in just a second, but before he does, something I'm fond of saying on the show, and that I often get a lot of pushback on, is that, you know, if there are 7.5 billion people on this planet, it's realistic to say that there are 7.5 billion genders on this planet, because we, you know, as much as we might try to like group and clump people together, that we really are entirely unique in that way. That's talking about gender, but everything that you're describing about hormones and genetics and just the interplay of the way we present sexually, is it fair to say that everybody has not just unique genetics, but a unique sexuality as well?
I'm sure, yeah. And of course, we end up at some point having to use some categories and having to use some assumptions, because otherwise it would be very hard to really study medicine or come up with treatment plans, because you can't 100% be individualistic. But at least you can have a starting point with people, and you can use a category to group things to some extent. It's not meant to be an end-all be-all. It's meant to more easily organize your thoughts and organize things that you're going to do. But we learn, even if you take a lower level science class, a lot of the things that they tell you are not entirely accurate, because you're not at a point where you can really understand the nuance yet. You need to understand something before you can move on and uncover the more nitty gritty, or the things that don't really follow the rules. So it's not meant to be an end point. That's not the place that we're getting to. That's the place where we're starting. And then as you learn more, you can branch out and say, okay, maybe we can switch to thinking about it in this way. Or one of my favorite examples for this is like, if you took a chemistry class and someone says that this molecule is hydrophobic, and your teacher may have described it as this doesn't like water, or it's scared of water. We all know that molecules aren't scared of anything. That's not real.
Sure.
But it's a tool to help your brain kind of wrap your mind around what's happening. And then once you learn that, you can abandon that kind of heuristic and say, okay, that wasn't really accurate, but it helped me understand that now, okay, we can violate the rule, so to speak.
Yeah. So at best, these labels are somewhat descriptive. They give us sort of a
Yes.
sense of a thing, but they're not prescriptive, as in you must have this, this, and this in order to qualify.
Absolutely. And you put that very beautifully.
Glad to hear it. With that in mind, Nate, who you got pulled up for us?
Oh, let me just pull up my magic telephone machine. Operator, give me Sebas. We've got Sebas from Illinois. Pronouns are he, him, and he is an atheist, but believes that some of the gender roles between men and women are correct. Sebas, what have you got to say tonight?
Well, thank you for accepting me. I'm also, I'm thank you very much for accepting my call. But yeah, so I'm more of, how do I say, a gender traditionalist. Like, I definitely, I would agree with the point that that gender can be fluid, gender can be that, and what they are. But I just think that when it comes to like sexuality, and just to, I agree with everything that Ben had to say. I think that's a very good. But there's when it comes to, I would say, sexuality, I think there's some things that can be generalized, in my opinion.
Let's check in really quickly on what you actually mean when you say sexuality, because in my experience, the way we live our lives is the way we live our sex, and that sex is not this like sacred and separate part of our humanity. But I want to make sure I'm understanding what you actually mean. So when you say that men and women have different roles to play sexually, what are you talking about?
Well, I'm talking about I would say when I mean roles, well, let me clarify roles. I mean, there are things that I can prescribe that men and women sexually prefer. And
Universally?
Like, there are some things that, not universally, but I would say generally. Not like, of course there are exceptions to the rule, but I'm saying that on a balance of probabilities, a man is going to like XX. It's the XYZ out of a woman, and a woman's going to like XYZ out of a man. And I'm talking about women and men here. I'm only talking about cisgender, heterosexual men and women.
Can I ask a question?
Well, we just spent the last 30 minutes acknowledging that we don't entirely know what a man is or what a woman is, like how those terms apply. But I'll give you a little more leeway. Ben, I didn't mean to interrupt you though. Please jump in here.
Oh no, you're good. I want to ask some questions. First of all, it seems interesting that you want to narrow this down to cis heterosexual men and women. So you already started with a broad generalization of in general, all men and all women prefer these things sexually, and then you narrowed it, so it's no longer general. Now we're talking about a subset of people. But also, how come we need to have a generalization at all?
Well, I think this is just my personal view, is that I think that when it comes to, I would say, when it comes to like sexual wants of what men and my definition here, men want, I think that people think that men don't want this thing and women don't want this, and that we're all individuals. Well, I would say, men find some attributes sexually attractive on a woman for a particular reason, and women find sexual attractive.
Sebas, if I could just interrupt you real quick. Instead of saying this thing or that attribute, can you be specific? Like dumb it, like fill in the actual words that you're thinking. Like if you're thinking big boobs, say big boobs.
For example, okay, I'm saying is that when it comes to sexual, like for example, in relationships, like men, for example, like women. Let me think about women because it's better. Women like a man who's usually taller than them, handsome than them, usually makes more money from them, and that sexually arouses them as a man. Like they're not going to like, for example, a man who is, let's say, shorter than them or overweight or financially kind of broke. They like
I do
man who
appreciate you being
all the
specific. I'm going to interrupt you here just because I feel like we've got the picture. Anybody who's watched a show on the CW in the last 10 years probably heard this list before. And I just have to point out the silliness of it. You know, we can talk about like the why or the, you know, why should we be doing this? Or like, is it useful to be putting pressure on these things? But there's just no reason to really statistically believe any of the things that you're saying. Like, we started off this show by spending a half an hour talking about the fact that nobody is really 100% man or 100% woman. We've well documented and discussed on this show that nobody is really 100% cis or 100% trans. Nobody's really 100% hetero or any of these other labels that you're trying to describe. So what you eventually have is there are some people that like some things and other people that don't like those things as much. And it stops being useful a very long time ago from a statistical standpoint and very quickly starts to become prescriptive. It very quickly starts to become, well, you know, you should do this because men are like that. You should do this because this is how women are supposed to be. And not only is it not accurate in the experience of many, 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 many people, but I just don't understand the function of it. Like, you sitting here and saying women like guys who have a lot of money, what benefit does that philosophy have for you or anybody listening or really anybody on the planet?
Well, no. My thing is that, let's say in general, I'm just saying is that there are I think there's some things that I would just say maybe from a personal standpoint, as I realize is that
so is it in general or is it personal? Do you understand what I mean about the statistical value of these statements?
Well,
because if we're zooming out and then zooming in and then going back and forth, like within group differences are going to be greater than without group differences. You know, I can say in general, people like Marvel movies, but that doesn't tell me anything about what it's going to be like to date that person or have sex with that person or any of the things that we're interested in talking about on this show. You're twisting yourself up into knots trying to figure out a way to describe and order the universe. And I can understand the impulse, but I just don't see you doing it in any sort of useful way. I'll back off here, guys. Am I off base here? Am I missing something in Sebas' argument?
Ben, you go first. I have a few things up my sleeve, but Ben, you go first.
Yeah, I think Christy hit it pretty well. It's just it seems funny to me, people's desire to make generalized statements about people. I don't see the utility of it. I really don't. I mean, I get that we have a human need to see patterns, but it's a crutch for your brain. Your brain likes patterns because it's difficult to accept that patterns aren't reality. It's a way for our brains to easily grasp concepts, but it's not useful and can be harmful.
So Sebas,
okay.
I feel like, and correct me if I'm wrong, I'm just going to throw this out, but it feels like you're kind of conflating what is or what has been sort of historically, culturally with what ought to be. So like the man as the provider or the man as the defender of the family. And do you think that there's any real utility in that? Like, can you give me a reason why a woman should want to date a tall man?
Well, I just think I think there's, in my opinion, like personally, that gender roles to some extent serve some sort of social utility. In my opinion,
what would that be?
Of course,
I'm going to jump in and say that I appreciate that you have your opinion and that you personally believe this, and that's whatever it is. That doesn't apply to the other billions of us on this planet. And I would really encourage you to evaluate your philosophy, because I just don't know what use it's going to have. And I can demonstrate over and over and over again the remarkable harm that the philosophies that you're espousing, without any grounded basis for saying them, because this is just your belief and just your personal belief. Okay, so you personally chose this belief. You personally chose to believe in a world in which women are supposed to be this and men are supposed to be that. And you are going to be disappointed by every single man and every single woman that you meet that doesn't meet those criteria. And for what? For why? What possible pressure would you, why would you want to put that pressure on yourself to be tall or rich or whatever silly other thing, to put that pressure on women to be whatever it is that they're supposed to be? I want you to know that, Sebas, if this is your personal belief, then fine. You can believe whatever you want, but you're choosing to believe this, and I can't think of one good goddamn reason why.
Well, I think, in my opinion, is that there shouldn't be, men shouldn't be like this, or men shouldn't be particular like that. Of course, I think, in my opinion, that.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm just not interested anymore in your opinion on what people should be. I'm gonna give you just a few more seconds to say what you want to say, and then I think we're gonna move on to the next call.
Oh well, I appreciate that you feel that. My saying is that. I agree with you to some extent to what you're saying, that maybe to some extent that I might be prescriptive to some extent, but I'm just saying is that maybe there should be like some discussion between, like, for example, in relationships, when it comes to relationships, there should be discussions of what the roles should be between two people, and then there shouldn't be like no roles, essentially.
Two people. Two people, sure. Two genders, nah.
But
yeah. I mean, relationships don't even need two people. There are so many things that I want you to re-examine. You started off by saying the world is this way, and then you started to say, well, I believe that the world is this way, and then you started to say, well, I believe that the world should be this way, and I just don't understand why. So I appreciate your time. I appreciate your call. I would beg you to keep watching, to keep reading, and to watch this clip as many times as you need to hear yourself go from way out here to smaller and smaller and smaller and less accurate. So with that in mind,
Christy, speaking of clips.
Yeah, I was about to say, let's go ahead and take a moment and see what's been going on around the rest of the ACA.
We don't want multiple waves of this transphobia virus. Thank you very much. We don't want new variants of the transphobia virus. We don't want to go through Greek letters of transphobia viruses. No, thank you.
You're attributing, obviously, a lot of importance to the order, and I think that where the major disagreement comes from here is the origin of that order. Not to be glib, but are you familiar with evolution?
I'm generation old, so it's not a surprise to me really that different cultures and different generations have different attitudes towards sex.
Are you using your mind to come to conclusions?
Don't have any choice.
That's right. Thank you. That's great. Someone answered a question today. I feel great. I'm done. That's it.
Yay, we're done, Kenneth.
God doesn't need to change his mind. He's seen all of time. To suggest that God changes his mind over time would make God subject to time, but God is timeless. See? I can do this shit all day long.
That's classic. I remember asking my parents when I was like 10 years old, why did God change his mind? And they're like, well, you see,
rainbows. Shut up. It's fine. It's fine.
Yeah. Go to your room, Nate. God.
Right? Well, you know what? Before we jump back into the interview, let's take another call if we can.
Okay, let's talk to Nick. Hey, Nick, pronouns are he, him, and he is a fellow snow bro from the lovely country of Canada. Nick grew up Christian, still learning. He's wondering if it's a good idea to convince religious people of non-binary genders. Nick, welcome to the show. You are on Secular Sexuality.
Wondering, this is something that might have sort of helped convince me, I guess, of different sexualities or different, genders, I guess, of people. When I was Christian, that there's actually a scientific backing behind some different genders and that kind of thing. So I wondered if you guys thought this might be a good sort of stepping off point to introduce, my hardcore Christian family members or friends or whatever about the concept of trans people and that kind of thing.
Yeah, well, there's a lot to unpack there. And I think the most important one, Ben kind of already alluded to, is that distinction between sex and gender. And certainly we've, talked about that a million different times on this show. But, I think that the conversation we've been having about the sort of like blended nature of sex and how there is not this like two discrete packages, very much flies in the face of the whole, male, female, he created them kind of dichotomy. But I want to be really sensitive to the idea that we might be presenting, which is that somebody's gender needs to be like evidenced in their genetics, or that we need to be able to like point towards a specific hormone in order to like validate or verify somebody's experience of their gender. And so to that end, I perhaps feel a little concerned, while acknowledging that my faith completely fell apart the moment I started looking into a lot of these very same questions. So that's kind of it for me. I'll back off and let y'all jump in.
Nick, is your question like, is it worth it? That's kind of what I read from the call screener notes. Is that kind of what you're getting at? Or is it kind of like, how do I do it?
I'm probably using some of the wrong words, but I'm just wondering if that could be sort of like a jumping off point. Not necessarily, I've been listening to the show for a while now. I've listened to, a bunch of back episodes and that kind of thing, where I understand that that's not exactly what we're, I guess, aiming for in the long run, but as sort of a jumping off point to start the conversation in the right direction with sort of hardcore religious people.
So I don't know if science is the direction we want to take with something like this, in all honesty, because kind of what I mentioned a bit earlier is people love to look at trans people as pathologies. And I think I don't want to give ammo to people to say, yeah, you're diseased or you have an illness because you're trans or you're non-binary. So it's kind of a weird thing, because normally I would love to say, yeah, we need to go hardcore to the evidence. You need to prove things to me. But with something so sociological and so culture dependent, society dependent, individual dependent, it's one that I don't really want to give people the idea that we're diseased in any way. So that's the one reason why I wouldn't jump straight to science on this one, even though I might say that for other things. And I do think, if we can greatly differentiate between sex and gender, because I don't want kind of their religious views on either of those things. They're typically wrong on both fronts of that, but I think it's a different conversation with regard to the science behind the sex versus the sociology and the psychology behind being trans.
Yeah,
Okay,
one thing I might
that's fair.
try
I
with a
appreciate
religious
that.
person, Nick, is like maybe something like, well, either God's wrong, they're wrong, or you're wrong. And God doesn't make mistakes. There seem to be an awful lot of folks who identify as non-binary, gay, trans, what have you. And they seem pretty convinced of it. So if God's never wrong, and we've got all these people who seem to be having this lived experience, and the only other option that I can think of is that maybe you're wrong, is that maybe somewhere we could start off, right? Like, consider the fact that you might be incorrect in your views, and kind of getting back to what I was saying earlier, is it worth it to proceed with this person? Like, can you admit that you might have things mixed up? What do you think of that?
Yeah, that's fair. I honestly, I just was wanted to hear your guys' opinion on it. You're definitely far more of the experts on this stuff than me, so I just was curious if that was a path that you guys thought was worth taking. But it sounds like it's probably not really a good idea, and I really do appreciate Ben's input on that one for sure.
Hey, these two are the experts.
Well, I'll just say it of course depends on the environment, right? On the situation. I've acknowledged on this show a number of times that it was watching a lot of queer film and realizing that these gay people weren't just making these like sinful decisions out of nothing or just to, spite God, and pulling on that thread. Really, I mean, it got me here. I mean, my dad would be so pissed if he knew that I was hosting a atheist sex show with all of you damn dirty heathens, because this is so much the opposite of the messaging that I was taught. And so, yeah, I do think that those like very deeply human stories that involve people's gender, that involve people's sexuality, and the like collision course that those very real human beings are on against a nameless, faceless, shapeless ideology that's full of like vitriol and hate towards them, that's going to move people. And I do think that those are stories worth sharing. But in terms of like using the existence of complicated genetics as sort of a gotcha card for, your average rank and file Christian, I share a lot of Ben's concerns.
I wouldn't start there either.
But I do really appreciate your call and your
for that,
interest
guys.
in all this. Yeah, well, thank you.
Yeah,
You
no,
have
that's
a great
awesome.
night.
I truly appreciate it. I just, if I could quickly, Nate, I just wanted to throw it out there as a fellow construction worker. I also wear a pink hard hat, and it's some of the greatest conversation starters I ever had.
Ah, yes, my man. Love it.
Nice.
Well, Nick, I'll leave you with the maxim that I've always lived by when confronting religious folks is it worth it? Does this person matter enough to me to actually try to sway them? Do I think there actually is a chance that they'll change their mind? Are they actually interested in the truth? It's all good things to think about when you're having these conversations on the job site in your pink hard hat. Thanks for calling, Nick.
Yeah, great night.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, well,
Okay,
Ben,
that's at least 2 Canadians that work in construction that wear pink hard hats. So,
I mean, I'm going to go ahead and just assume that he's wearing one because of you, that you're the trendsetter, whether he knew it or not, that you're starting a movement here. And I just appreciate it and want to be a part of it.
yes, the pink hard hat movement. Oh, yeah.
But Ben, this is obviously a very like big and squirrely type of topic, and I know we're a little bit all over the place, and I really appreciate you being willing to sort of walk us through like the actual, real, serious, important stuff, while being willing to kind of dumb it down and field some of our questions as we try to wrap our head around all of this. I can't help but feel like we keep like zooming in and zooming out and zooming in. But with that in mind, there's a idea that I've seen floated in a couple of different papers that I was hoping you could kind of walk us through or weigh in on to a certain extent, that somewhat suggests that genetics and phenotypes are something like a hardware structure for our, what I'll call our sexuality or our biological sex. And I'm using that term like perhaps fallaciously and very softly, but our actual anatomy might be constructed largely out of those things, but that it's also very possible that somewhere along the line in the process, our hormones might come in and sort of flip a switch in our software, in our brain development, that leads to a gender that might be somewhat discordant with our biology, with our like hardware. Is that software hardware disconnect at all an accurate way of perhaps beginning to understand transgender identities, or is that totally off the mark?
I mean, it's possible. It's very difficult to touch into something like that because it again, people looking for these kinds of answers might be ending up at a place of trying to look for a hormone imbalance to treat someone's gender identity disorder or transsexualism as if it's some kind of disease, which we're doing a really good job trying to get out of that line of thinking. We don't really know what causes somebody to be trans or to have gender dysphoria or to have some discordance with their body and their gender identity. It's interesting listening to other trans people and their experience with their gender. And this kind of topic, I'm going to talk more from my own experience and my friend's experience, because I'm not a neuroscientist, so I don't want to talk too in depth on something that I haven't really read up on. But from my own experience, I know that people have said that they believe that people who are trans men have high levels of testosterone or low levels of estrogen or something, and that trans women are the opposite. And it's been posited as well. I've heard people say that sexuality is similar, and it's really problematic to be thinking that way. But also I found it to be incorrect in that so I've only been on testosterone for about 7 months now. And before then, when I presented feminine, I'd taken the lesbian label for a while. It didn't really fit, but I knew I was attracted to women, and especially like feminine presenting people. And then it was funny because I started on testosterone and now I'm suddenly really sexually attracted to men. So the fact that male hormones made me more gay is interesting to me. But I don't really know the biological basis for why we feel differently in response to these hormones. But I personally, estrogen and progesterone make me very sad and make me very depressed. And talking with my friends who are trans women, they've said the exact opposite, that testosterone has made them depressed and that estrogen and progesterone have made them very happy. And I cannot wrap my mind around the fact that estrogen could make anybody feel happy, like, because that was never my experience. And probably the same that they view testosterone. Like, testosterone has changed my life in so many beneficial ways, and I don't know necessarily why that is, but it has. And it's something that people want a scientific answer to a lot of things. And with something like gender that is very specific to a person and can be very fluid and doesn't really have a set meaning to it. I mean, after all, like, what is a man? What is a woman? Like,
how do you find that control group? Yeah,
like what is that? Because everyone's experience is different. And if you were to ask somebody define a man, you can't really, I mean, you can say a list of things that might be more masculine, but you find women that like those things too. So does that make you a man? Like, what makes you a man? It's really difficult to say that. So I think maybe like it's better to not have a scientific answer in that, I think.
Oh, that's so zen.
It is a little bit.
And I do appreciate that. You know, people will come into my counseling office saying, like, I don't know, maybe I'm trans, like maybe I don't know, I'm questioning. I've never really felt like a man, or I've never really felt like a woman. And I obviously take those questions very seriously, but I also have to gently remind people that I don't necessarily know what being a man feels like, you know, or what being a woman feels like. I certainly experience my gender in some ways that I really enjoy, in some ways that I, you know, often don't. And, you know, there's a very complex interplay there. But if you are looking for a box that you can check off, or something that you can like really put your finger on, you just have to embrace the mystery of life and sort of the ineffability of being a human being. I know that we're kind of blending philosophy and science and
Well, you check
sociology
the box
with
that makes you feel
genetics.
good. Yeah.
Yeah, right.
No.
I mean, there are so many things that we are touching on here, but before I let Nate grab another phone call, I just wanted to ask if there were any other factors, or if there were any factors that we could point to that might help us to understand sort of the like the physical and the medical and the biological underpinnings of gender. I mean, hormones are in there, genetics are in there. What do we know about how these things maybe lead to gender?
I mean, we don't know much, and that's interesting. It's an interesting place for us to admit that we don't know and we don't have an answer, and maybe science will have one at some point. But even just within the medicine of understanding a person who is trans and having very beneficial treatments such as hormone replacement therapy and gender confirming surgeries, we have evidence that shows the most effective method to treat gender dysphoria is by transition. So if people want to point to the science, like, okay, we could have this mental masturbation, if you will, about like what is the key thing that makes you like male or female. But at the end of the day, it's what makes me happy to be alive and happy to be me. My psychiatry attending this past month, because I was on pediatric psychiatry, and something that he said that really resonated with me about my own experience with gender and my transition is that you are the only person that's going to be with you for every moment of your life. You're going to wake up to yourself every single day. Are you happy with the person you're waking up with? And thinking about that, like in my pre-transition state, I was not happy with the person I woke up to every day. And the things that hormones have done for me, I'm happy now. I'm happy to wake up being me. If I had to go, and this is truth, I'm going to have to go the rest of my life being me, with me in this body, even with certain modifications, it will still be my body. I'm happy with it. I'm happy to go through that journey and seeing the practical application of getting off of our high horses, being like, what is it like mean to be a certain sex or gender? The end of the day, the answer is figuring out how to help people have a positive existence on this earth. And right? I don't know.
Yeah.
That's kind of where I'm coming from with that.
It's not about who has a penis or who has a vulva. It's not about who has this hormone level or that hormone level, or who is as swift as a coursing river, or who has all the force of a great typhoon. It's just about how to be a person and how to be happy being it. I really, really love that answer.
That was a great answer. And I'd also like to point out that mental masturbation is the second best kind of masturbation.
I don't know. I think we could debate the rankings, and I don't know. We should probably do another erotic hypnosis episode before we get too much further down this road.
I'm down for it, Christy. Let's do it.
But
I'm not paying you though, pro bono.
I meant for the show, an episode of
for the show.
Nate.
Oh, for the show.
Yeah, right. That show that we're doing right now.
Wait, we're on a show?
We're on a show? What?
Not
No,
just
we're
us
not.
getting drunk and talking about gender. It's actually a call-in show. And let's see if we can't take one more call before we start to wrap things up for the night.
All right. We'll move on from your woke liberal lies and talk to Tony. Pronouns are he, him, from Virginia. And Tony is looking to better understand what non-binary gender means. Tony, you are on the air. What's on your mind, buddy?
Hi. Yeah. So I've been watching your show for a little bit. I've been trying to better educate myself on the subject because I am a gay man.
Awesome.
And I know a lot of conservatives, and so I'm not trans, and I don't know any trans people, and so they've asked me a lot of questions, and I usually preface was like, I don't know, but I find that my ignorance is kind of being utilized for their hate, so I kind of think it's necessary now for me to try to understand a little bit better. And so I always understood sexuality to be, or not sexuality, I'm sorry, gender to be an expression of like somebody's sex, you know? So like if somebody was born biological male and they identify as a woman, you know, they're expressing themselves, I guess their gender as a woman. But the whole gender non-binary thing doesn't really make sense to me, because if you don't, you know, because if you're identifying something that, you know, doesn't have a sex, I don't understand how that's really different from like just saying you have a different personality type, I guess. I'm just kind of confused.
Yeah, so something really important to address here is that your gender is not related to your sex. So your sex is your biology, but your gender is how you interact with the world. So it can't be a representation or an expression of your sex. That's two different things, because we have trans people who clearly, I'm a man, I'm a trans man. My body is what people would say to be female. I don't think that my gender is an expression of this body that I have. But clearly, if we can delineate between those two, I think it might be easier for you to understand where non-binary fits in, because then too, we have your gender identity, which is how you relate to the rest of the world with being male or female or non-binary. And then your expression is slightly different. So your expression is related to your gender, not necessarily to your sex. So how I express being a man might be different than somebody else. So I could be a man and still like to wear the color pink, wear my pink hard hat, and I'm still a man, but that's an expression of my masculinity. Or I might have, I might like to do something that is quote unquote girly. I'm still a man doing something that is more feminine. And that would be my expression of my gender. So separating out the expression from the identity, people who are non-binary can express gender in however they want, or as androgynously as they want. But what they're referring to with a non-binary gender identity is when they're confronted with two boxes on a form that says, are you male or are you female? They would probably say, no, none of these boxes really fit. Like if they're in public and someone wants to call them sir or ma'am, both of those might sound really icky to them. And I know some people who are non-binary who so non-binary is an umbrella term. So you have some people who might use non-binary as their label. You can also have people who identify as non-binary and agender, where they don't have any gender expression or people or any gender identity. You can also have people who are bigender, who identify with two genders, multiple genders. So I want to make sure that when we're talking about this, we're not using expression and sex. We're talking about identities.
So I guess I don't understand then. So like in society, right? So like if we use gender in society as a way to identify each other, so I can look at somebody and like identify like, oh, okay, they're, you know, that person, you know, is a woman, has female body parts. That guy is a man, has man, or whatever, you know what I mean? For these roles that we kind of box each other into. I guess I don't understand how. I haven't.
Tony, Tony, think of this in your head. So
Yeah.
think of a woman as 0. Think of a man as 1. How many numbers are there between 0 and 1?
Infinite.
Right. So everybody is going to fall somewhere, perhaps on that spectrum, but everybody's going to be different and everybody's going to have an answer. And I know from my time working as a volunteer for Recovering from Religion is that for a lot of non-binary people, it can change. Like it can change from day to day. It can change from month to month. It's just what do I feel like expressing today? And that's kind of where a lot of those terms fall. And we have to remember that like language serves us. It's not the other way around, right? So this is just whatever label makes that person feel comfortable. Today it might be non-binary. Tomorrow it might be gender fluid. You know, it can change from day to day, and that's okay. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean it's okay. I guess I don't really care so much if somebody wants to identify differently. I just want to make sure that when I'm using my words and talking to my friends, that I'm not saying anything crazy. But
I think intent goes a long way, and I think you've got a good intent, Tony. So I don't think anyone's going to crucify you if you get it wrong.
And it's okay to acknowledge that you are not non-binary, that you are not transgender, and so that your ability to speak to the to the NB experience is a little bit limited. That makes sense. You know, you can describe it and we can all sit here and have a vocabulary lesson, but nobody needs to expect you to be an expert on a culture and a lived experience that you're not necessarily a part of.
So would it be more accurate to think of it as like gender being some sort of sliding scale between masculine and feminine?
It tends to be, yeah.
You could think of it that way, yeah.
There are certainly people that feel like even that model is overly simplified and that would prefer to like sort of opt out. You know, oftentimes people who we might describe as being non-binary would actually call themselves like agender and say that they have no gender. It's not that they're right in the middle of male and female. It's that they are zero gender. And does that make sense? You know, from like a logical state or position, maybe not, but people aren't logical. You know, that's not to dismiss the experience of anybody who's agender or the experience of anybody who's non-binary or anybody else's experience. I'm not at all meaning to do that. I just mean to say that as somebody who works in the human sciences, we have to get very comfortable in health and human services with the fact that we're not usually able to put people into boxes. We're not usually able to apply a whole lot of logic, that human experiences don't tend to fit into concise language. And there's something really ineffable about gender. And that's in my opinion, a feature, not a flaw. And I think that we can embrace that while also being okay with the fact that we don't always have clear-cut words to try and describe what I'm feeling to you. And you're never going to be able to perfectly mind meld with me and get what it is like to have my specific gender. And that's okay. We can all just sort of enjoy being around each other, even if we don't fully understand one another.
Can I ask a question real quick, just to try to help you understand it a little bit?
Yeah.
Okay. So if let's say we met in public and I decided to refer to you as ma'am or call you she or use the name Susan, do you think if I did that repeatedly, how would you feel about that?
I think I would probably find that very upsetting. Yeah, I'd be pretty pissed.
Yeah, so think about that kind of feeling you get when someone misgenders you, and then a non-binary person might experience that feeling with being called female using those words, but they also feel that same feeling using the male terms as well. So, and of course, that's a simplification. You can have different preferences along that, like a sliding scale, like we were talking about. But thinking about it more in that way of, okay, I understand what it feels like to be misgendered. So this person just has a different experience of which terms cause them to feel that same way. And that's kind of might be an easier way to try to explain it to somebody.
Yeah, actually, that's not a bad idea, because I bet my friends would be pretty pissed off if I was trying to call them women. They'd probably not be happy about that.
Fair to say.
Yeah, don't go calling cousin Haas Susan.
Life ain't easy for a boy named Sue.
Wow, you went there, Christy. You went there. All right. Well, Tony, is there any final words you'd like to leave us with?
I have some formulating thoughts about another question that I might have, and maybe if I think about that a little bit deeper, maybe I'll call on the show another time.
Yeah, please do, or shoot us an email or whatever else. We're more than happy to answer any way we can, whether we're online live or not.
Yeah, Tony, send us an email at sex@atheistcommunity.org.
Appreciate it. Y'all have a good one.
Hey,
You
thanks
too.
so much.
Thanks for calling. I like Tony. He was nice.
Well, we have kind of touched on this, but I wanted to give you at least one chance, Ben, to acknowledge the fact that there is a much bigger sort of philosophical conversation, I think, to be had here about why someone should even be expected to like have their genes tested in order to validate their identity, or why we should even be like looking at our bodies in order to express ourselves. But putting that conversation aside for just a moment, what should we understand about sort of the biological or the genetic underpinnings of our gender or these other pieces of our identity?
It all comes down to, like, it's complicated and you can't make assumptions about anybody. So really what we need to do looking forward to the future and how we interact with people based on this information is just don't assume anything about the person you're talking to. Make sure you're listening, engaging in honest conversation, not just weaponizing certain scientific points to try to make someone feel like they're the problem. So, the goal at the end of the day here, especially in this community, is humanism and trying to be the best people we can be, and making the world better than the way we found it. So, it's complicated. Don't assume you know things that you don't know, and make sure that you are being a good listener and just kind of, being a good person.
Yeah. It is complicated, and I realize that can feel like something of a cop-out response when I, am like hearing it from my little brother who is arguing about how, XX this and XY that and all of these kinds of things. But I think a little bit of humility on these topics is valuable because, we don't all have the opportunity to study medicine, but even doing so, there are so many questions that are just we're not able to answer as a society right now. So for folks who do want to kind of take that next step or who would like to dive into all of this a little bit further, do you have any recommendations for good resources or just for places for people to learn more or try to understand these things?
Yeah, I'll plug my own channel because I do talk about this, Student Dr. Ben on YouTube. I have videos about all of these pathways for embryologic development of biological sex. I have so many videos. They're early on in my channel, so my quality has increased since then. But the content's still there, and I break down the pathways individually and analyze what happens if this enzyme doesn't work, or what happens if this chromosome has the SRY or doesn't. We go through step by step what happens, what triggers what to happen, how you get the results that we do. So if you really want to learn more about the nitty gritty of this stuff, you can go watch those videos on my channel. Also, any other trans resources. If you know any trans people, talk to them. I do want to make sure that I'm warning you of certain things not to talk to them about. Trans people are not obligated to answer your questions on anything. So even if you have questions and even if you have a trans friend, make sure that you get consent, that you ask them, hey, is it okay if I ask you these questions? Like those of us who are on these shows, generally, when we're on a show, we'll answer all your questions because we are consenting by being in this space and by opening ourselves up to questions. But if you have a friend, like, make sure that you are asking them appropriate questions and that you're not meaning harm by them, and also that you're not expecting them to be your educator on this when they necessarily don't need to be.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that thought. Before Nate takes us out for the night, did you have any other final words that you wanted to make sure to leave an impression with the audience about tonight?
I'm still waiting to hear what vajankles are.
We did make a pledge to the audience.
We did, so I feel like we ought to give Ben like at least like a minute. Tell us what vajankles are, because I gotta know.
Okay. So I had a friend send me this meme or something on Facebook. It was a listing from some kind of marketplace website for vajankles, and it is a sex toy that is a foot, like it's a foot with an ankle on it and a vagina on top of like where the ankle would be.
So it's like a pocket pussy.
So it's a fleshlight
that's shaped like a foot. For people who are into that, no kink shaming here. If you're into
want
that,
a fucking ankle,
there's products for you. But it was funny because the post had said like lightly used vajankle, and then it said no low balls. I know what I got. I was just like, it was just a weird ad. It was a weird ad.
Wouldn't you want the part that you penetrate to be like on the bottom of the foot so that you get like the visual of the foot? I mean,
they might make those too, but I just saw the vajankle.
I wouldn't know if they did either. I don't know what you're suggesting, Ben. I wouldn't know.
Yeah. After the show, I can send you the picture. But
Okay. If the crew will allow us, we will put a link to this ad in the show notes if we're allowed.
I don't know
folks,
if people
but
want
I'm
it. I don't
not
know if people
making
want
any
it.
promises.
Yeah, that's how you get a content strike.
Yes, or you could just probably Google it yourself and find it on your own time, because I'm sure a marketplace post as legendary as that, you're gonna be able to find it, folks. You're gonna be able to find it. But Ben, you mentioned that you do have a YouTube channel. Would you like to plug it once more?
Yeah, Student Dr. Ben, just as you're reading it here. That's my YouTube name. I also do have a Twitch under the same name that I play trivia every Friday. So come hang out for that too. That's just more freeform stuff. But most of my fun scientific content is on YouTube. So you can find me there. I'm currently going through a series on medicine in folklore. So if you're interested in vampires and werewolves, we talk about diseases that might have caused paranoia surrounding those afflictions in the past. So hope you all go watch those videos. They're fun.
That's pretty cool. I am always down for some trivia, although, judging by my last result, maybe I shouldn't be. But moving on, folks, if you would like to get into some more content from the atheist community of Austin, we have a one-stop shop for all of our shows, and that is at tiny.cc/AEN podcasts. All of our content is available there in audio format only. So if you can't catch the show live, if you want to listen to the shows at work or driving, anything like that, keep your eyes on the road, folks. AEN podcasts. Also, on Facebook, you can get through to us at the Secular Sexuality Facebook group. That's tiny.cc/FBSSG. By fans, for fans. We're all there, though. So if you want to continue the conversation, hit us up there. And also, you can catch us in the ACA Discord. It's tiny.cc/ACD Discord. We've got a lively community there. A few channels, one for secular sexuality, another for just general gender and sexuality questions. And we've got a great group of folks in there that you can always hit up with all your questions and concerns. And also, we have merch. I'm wearing some of that merch right now. You can get yourself some of your own merch at tiny.cc/merchaca. go and buy yourself a pillow, buy yourself a t-shirt. I can tell you from experience, the t-shirts are soft, supple, and ever so wonderful. And before we go, finally, let's get a look at the wonderful people who do all the work behind the scenes so that we three can sit up here and talk to you all. Let's get the crew up. Hey, crew. Hey. How y'all doing? Colson's like, kill me. Oh, my God. All right. But, folks, that is our show for tonight. Christy, final words.
Yeah, I guess I don't have much to say to folks other than to remind them that, male, female, cis or trans or NB or whatever else, that you can, turn off your safe search and maybe order yourself a nice vajankle or two and take a quiet moment for yourself to give yourself a big ol' orgasm. Or, better yet, give somebody else one.
Watch Talk Heathen live Sundays at 1 p.m. Central. Visit tiny.cc/YTTH and call into the show at 512-991-9242 or connect to the show online at tiny.cc/callth.